August 15th, 1943, 400 miles southwest of Iceland. The Atlantic stretched endless and grey beneath a low ceiling of clouds, its surface broken only by the occasional whitecap that caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky. Inside the cramped cockpit of a PBY-5A Catalina flying boat, Lieutenant Commander Howard Adey adjusted his headset and squinted through the salt-stained windscreen. The twin Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines thrummed their steady rhythm, each revolution carrying him deeper into what submariners called the Black Gap, that deadly stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, where convoys traveled naked and alone. The radio crackled with static, then delivered its grim message in the clipped tones of British Naval Command. Convoy HX251, 37 vessels, last reported position 58 degrees north, 23 degrees west. No contact for 18 hours. Adey's gloved fingers tightened on the control yoke. Somewhere below, in the grey immensity of the North Atlantic, merchant ships loaded with tanks, ammunition, and food for a starving Britain were sailing blind into an ocean crawling with German submarines. The mathematics were simple and terrible. If the U-boats found the convoy first, 40,000 tons of Allied shipping would vanish beneath the waves before dawn. Behind Adey, radar operator Technical Sergeant James Morrison hunched over a green circular screen no larger than a dinner plate, watching ghostly traces of light sweep around its face like the hands of some electronic clock counting down to catastrophe. This was the ASV Mark III, a revolutionary centimetric radar set that could theoretically detect a submarine periscope at 5 miles even through fog and rain. Theoretically. In practice, the temperamental device produced more false contacts than real ones, its sensitive circuits overwhelmed by the electronic noise of the aircraft's own engines and the metallic interference of the ocean's surface. The irony was not lost on the Allied commanders who had placed such desperate faith in these flying patrols. For 3 years, German U-boat commanders had ruled the Atlantic like medieval lords, their submarines moving unseen through the shipping lanes, surfacing only to deliver death with mechanical precision. They had perfected the art of night attacks, rising from the depths after sunset to hunt convoys by moonlight, then vanishing beneath the waves before Allied escorts could mount an effective response. To the seasoned captains of the Kriegsmarine, American patrol planes were nothing more than costly toys, lumbering flying boats whose pilots flew endless circles over empty ocean while real sailors fought the war beneath the waves. Kapitän Lieutenant Wolfgang Luth of U-181 had perhaps captured the sentiment best in his war diary. The Americans send their flying machines to search for us in an ocean larger than their entire continent. They might as well try to find a specific fish in the Baltic. Their pilots see nothing but water and sky, while we see everything, their smoke, their wakes, their predictable routes. The Atlantic belongs to those who understand its moods, not to those who fly above them like tourists. This arrogance was not entirely unfounded. The consolidated PBY Catalina, despite its legendary reliability and impressive range, was a product of peacetime thinking, designed for air-sea rescue operations and coastal reconnaissance rather than submarine warfare. Its maximum speed of 196 miles per hour made it vulnerable to fighter attack, while its limited armament, typically 4 Mark 44 depth charges and a handful of machine guns, seemed inadequate against the sophisticated submarines emerging from German shipyards. The aircraft's crew of 9 men was crammed into a fuselage that vibrated constantly, leaked in rough weather, and offered all the comfort of a flying oil drum. Yet necessity had transformed this ungainly amphibian into something far more potent than its designers had ever imagined. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had evolved into a deadly game of technological leapfrog, each side developing new weapons and countermeasures in a desperate race for survival. The German submarine force, once content to hunt by sight and sound, now faced an enemy that could reach across hundreds of miles of ocean with invisible electronic fingers, probing the darkness with radio waves that traveled at the speed of light. The genesis of this transformation lay not in American aircraft factories, but in the secret laboratories of British radar researchers who had learned to harness centimeter-wavelength radio waves for maritime reconnaissance. Unlike the meter-wave radar sets that had protected Britain during the Blitz, these new devices could detect small targets with unprecedented precision, their narrow beams capable of distinguishing between a submarine's periscope and the natural clutter of ocean waves. When combined with powerful searchlights and improved depth charges, they promised to turn the tables on Germany's submarine fleet in a single stroke. The first operational tests had been conducted in the spring of 1943, when Royal Air Force Coastal Command began fitting selected aircraft with the ASV Mark III radar and the revolutionary Lee Light, a searchlight capable of producing 2 million candle power, bright enough to illuminate a submarine at 2 miles distance. The results were immediately apparent. U-boat sightings increased dramatically. Successful attacks multiplied, and for the first time since the war began, German submarine commanders found themselves hunted rather than hunting. But it was the Americans who would perfect this deadly combination, their vast industrial capacity and operational flexibility, allowing them to deploy centimetric radar on a scale that the hard-pressed British could never match. By August 1943, nearly every PBY Catalina and B-24 Liberator engaged in Atlantic patrol duty carried the new radar equipment. Their crews trained in techniques that would have seemed like science fiction just months earlier. Lieutenant Commander Adi represented this new breed of maritime patrol pilot, a man who combined traditional flying skills with an understanding of electronic warfare that would have baffled his predecessors. A graduate of the Navy's radar school at Corpus Christi, Texas, he had spent hundreds of hours learning to interpret the cryptic signals that appeared on his scope, distinguishing between genuine submarine contacts and the myriad false returns generated by seabirds, floating debris, and atmospheric anomalies. His aircraft carried not just depth charges and machine guns, but direction-finding equipment, sonobuoys, and a camera capable of photographing targets in complete darkness. The technology that made such capabilities possible represented one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. The heart of the ASV Mark III was a magnetron tube capable of generating short pulses of extremely high-frequency radio energy, each pulse lasting only a few microseconds, but containing enough power to illuminate objects dozens of miles away. These radio waves, reflected back from any solid object they encountered, were captured by a sensitive receiver and displayed on a cathode ray tube as bright spots of light against a dark background. To the trained operator, each spot told a story. Its brightness indicated the size of the target, its movement revealed speed and direction, and its persistence distinguished genuine contacts from atmospheric phenomena. Yet for all its sophistication, the system remained dependent on human skill and judgment. Radar could detect a submarine, but only a trained eye could determine whether that submarine was friendly or hostile, surfaced or submerged, preparing to attack or attempting to escape. The deadly game of submarine warfare had become a contest between human intuition and mechanical precision, with the fate of entire convoys hanging on split-second decisions made by young men who had learned their trade in peacetime flying clubs and aviation schools. As Adi's Catalina droned through the Atlantic twilight, Technical Sergeant Morrison suddenly straightened over his radar scope. "Contact bearing 270, range 8 miles, he announced, his voice sharp with excitement. "Large target. Moving northeast at approximately 12 knots. Adi banked the flying boat toward the indicated bearing, his pulse quickening as he realized what those numbers might represent. A large target moving at 12 knots could only mean one thing: a surfaced submarine running at maximum speed, probably positioning itself for a night attack on the missing convoy. The first encounters between radar-equipped aircraft and German submarines had been disasters for both sides. Pilots, unused to their new electronic eyes, had wasted countless hours chasing false contacts and phantom returns, their depth charges falling harmlessly into empty ocean while real submarines escaped undetected. The U-boat commanders, initially caught off guard by the sudden appearance of aircraft in areas they had considered safe, quickly adapted their tactics, learning to dive at the first sound of aircraft engines and to surface only in weather conditions that might defeat radar detection. The learning curve had been steep and bloody. In the early months of 1943, Coastal Command had lost nearly as many aircraft as submarines sunk, their crews falling victim to German fighters, mechanical failures, and the simple exhaustion that came from flying 10-hour missions over the world's most hostile ocean. Aircraft would disappear without a trace. their final radio transmissions often nothing more than a terse report of radar contact before static claimed their voices forever. Lieutenant Frank Morrison of VP-63 had been among the first casualties of this new type of warfare. On March 12, 1943, his PBY had detected what appeared to be a submarine contact 40 miles north of the Azores. Morrison had descended through broken clouds to investigate, his radar operator reporting a steady contact that seemed to be a U-boat running on the surface. What they found instead was U-221, whose commander had been monitoring Allied radio transmissions and had positioned his boat to ambush any aircraft that responded to a false distress signal. Morrison's Catalina was shot down by the submarine's deck guns before it could transmit a position report. All 9 crew members lost in the frigid waters of the mid-Atlantic. Such setbacks only strengthened the resolve of Allied commanders who understood that the Battle of the Atlantic would be won or lost by the side that could best integrate new technology with proven tactics. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, had committed the Navy's most experienced patrol squadrons to perfecting radar-guided attacks, establishing training centers where crews could practice the complex coordination required to find, track, and destroy submerged targets. By summer 1943, American maritime patrol pilots were logging more radar-guided attacks in a single month than their British colleagues had managed in an entire year. The tactical revolution extended far beyond the aircraft themselves. Intelligence analysts at the Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group had developed new mathematical models for predicting submarine behavior, their calculations based on captured German documents, traffic analysis, and the growing database of radar contacts being generated by patrol aircraft. These analysts could determine with increasing accuracy where U-boats were likely to be found, what routes they would follow, and when they would be most vulnerable to air attack. The German response had been characteristically thorough and systematic. By mid-1943, every U-boat carried radar warning receivers capable of detecting Allied search radars at ranges far exceeding the radar's own detection capability. Submarine commanders were instructed to dive immediately upon receiving any radar signal, remaining submerged until they were certain the threat had passed. New tactics emphasized deeper diving depths, longer submerged patrols, and communication procedures designed to minimize radio transmissions that might be intercepted by Allied direction-finding stations. But technology was only part of the equation. The real transformation came in the crews who flew these missions, men who had adapted to a new kind of warfare that demanded both courage and scientific precision. They flew for hours through fog and storm, their eyes glued to radar screens and instrument panels, hunting an enemy they might never see with their naked eyes. The old romanticism of aerial combat, with its emphasis on individual skill and daring, had given way to a more complex reality in which victory belonged to those who could best integrate human judgment with mechanical capability. Technical Sergeant Morrison's voice cut through Addy's thoughts. Contact now, bearing 265, range 6 miles, speed steady at 12 knots. Signal strength indicates large surface vessel. Addy pushed the throttles forward, feeling the Catalina's engines respond with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat. Whatever was out there, it was real and substantial. No atmospheric phantom or electronic ghost, but something solid enough to reflect radio waves with mechanical consistency. The transformation of the U-boat war had not gone unnoticed by German naval command. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the submarine fleet, had watched with growing alarm as his monthly sinking reports showed a steady decline in merchant tonnage destroyed, even as the number of operational U-boats reached an all-time high. By August 1943, German submarines were being lost at a rate that exceeded their construction, and experienced commanders who had survived years of Atlantic patrols were disappearing with disturbing regularity. The statistics told a grim story for the Kriegsmarine. In January 1943, German U-boats had sunk 261,359 tons of Allied shipping while losing only 6 submarines. By July, those numbers had reversed. Shipping losses had dropped to 123,000 tons, while 28 U-boats had been destroyed, many of them by aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere in the middle of empty ocean. The careful mathematics of submarine warfare, which had once favored the hunters, now worked against them with mechanical precision. Captain Wolfgang Luth, the German Navy's most successful submarine commander, had captured the new reality in a letter to his wife written from his base in Lorient. The ocean is no longer our friend. Where once we moved like ghosts through the shipping lanes, now we are the hunted ones, tracked by invisible eyes that see through fog and darkness. The Americans have learned to make machines do what men cannot, to watch over thousands of miles of empty water and remember everything they see. As Adi's Catalina closed the distance to its radar contact, the crew began the complex preparations required for a night attack. Bombardier Sergeant Ralph Coleman checked the arming circuits on their 4 Mark 44 depth charges, each weapon containing 200 pounds of Torpex explosive designed to crush a submarine's hull through sheer hydraulic shock. Aviation machinist's mate, first class. Tony Ricci tested the Lee Light installation, its massive reflector and arc lamp housed in a retractable turret beneath the aircraft's wing. Radio operator Petty Officer Second Class Mike Santos monitored multiple frequencies, listening for distress signals from merchant ships or position reports from other patrol aircraft. The approach to a submarine contact required precise timing and coordination. The radar operator would guide the aircraft to within 2 miles of the target, at which point the pilot would begin a shallow dive toward the estimated position. At 1 mile distance, the Lee Light would be activated, its brilliant beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate whatever lay below. If the target proved to be a submarine, the pilot would have perhaps 30 seconds to position his aircraft for a depth charge attack before the U-boat could dive to safety. The margin for error was razor thin. Submarines could submerge in less than 60 seconds, and once below the surface, they became almost impossible to track with the radar equipment available in 1943. A pilot who hesitated or misjudged his approach would find himself attacking empty water while his target escaped into the protective darkness of the ocean depths. Success required not just courage, but the kind of split-second timing that could only be developed through constant practice and bitter experience. Contact bearing 260, range 4 miles, Morrison reported, his voice tight with concentration. Target appears to be maintaining course and speed. Adi began his descent, reducing power slightly to quiet the engines while maintaining enough airspeed to ensure quick maneuverability. Below them, the Atlantic had become a featureless expanse of black water broken only by occasional patches of phosphorescence, where waves disturbed the surface plankton. The night attack had become a deadly ballet performed in complete darkness, with each participant guided only by instruments and instinct. The submarine commander, if indeed that was what they were approaching, would be scanning the horizon for the telltale sound of aircraft engines while his lookouts swept the sky with binoculars, searching for the shadow that might betray an approaching threat. His radar warning receivers would be silent. Allied aircraft transmitted only short pulses of radio energy, and these new centimetric radars operated on frequencies that many German detection systems could not monitor. At 2 miles distance, Technical Sergeant Morrison made the critical call. Definite submarine contact, bearing 258, stationary or moving very slowly. Large conning tower visible on scope. Adi felt his heart rate increase as he realized they had found what they were looking for. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay a German U-boat, probably running on the surface to recharge its batteries or to improve its speed while pursuing the missing convoy. The Lee Light blazed to life with the intensity of a small sun, its 2 million candle power beam cutting through the Atlantic night like a sword of pure energy. For a moment, that seemed to last forever, the ocean surface appeared empty except for the endless ranks of waves marching toward the horizon. Then, caught in the brilliant circle of illumination like an actor on a stage, the unmistakable silhouette of a submarine materialized from the darkness. U-454, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Burkhard Hackländer, had been running on the surface for 3 hours, her diesel engines charging the massive batteries that would power her submerged operations, while her radio operator attempted to contact other submarines in the area. Hackländer was a veteran of 32 combat patrols, a master submariner whose boat had sunk over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping during 2 years of Atlantic operations. He had survived the worst that Allied anti-submarine forces could deliver, from depth charge attacks by destroyers to bombing runs by aircraft that had somehow spotted his boat in broad daylight. But he had never faced anything like the mechanical precision of radar-guided night attack. The Lee Light caught his submarine completely exposed, her crew scrambling toward the conning tower hatch as alarm bells shattered the night quiet. Hacklander shouted the order to dive, knowing even as he spoke that 30 seconds would not be enough time to reach the safety of deep water. His boat was caught in that most vulnerable of positions, too far from shore to run, too slow to fight, too exposed to hide. Adi pushed his Catalina into a steep dive, the aircraft's engines screaming as they accelerated toward the illuminated target. At 200 feet altitude and 180 miles per hour, he pulled the release handle that sent 4 depth charges tumbling toward the frantically diving submarine. The weapons struck the water in a precise pattern around U-454's hull, their fuses set to detonate at 30 feet depth, exactly the level where a crash-diving submarine would be most vulnerable to hydraulic shock. The explosions came as 4 thunderclaps that seemed to shake the entire ocean, massive columns of water and spray erupting into the lee light's beam as 800 pounds of high explosive detonated in perfect synchronization. For a moment, the sea surface disappeared in a chaos of foam and debris, the shock waves from the depth charges radiating outward in expanding circles of disturbed water. Then, as the spray settled and the foam dissipated, the ocean returned to its normal pattern of wind-driven waves. Of U-454, there was no trace except for a spreading slick of diesel fuel that gleamed like oil under the searchlight's glare. Hacklander and his crew of 47 men had joined the growing number of German submariners, who would never return from patrol. Their boat crushed by the precise application of explosive force, guided by electronic eyes that could see through the darkest night. The attack on U-454 represented more than just another tactical victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. It marked the emergence of a new form of warfare in which human skill and mechanical precision combined to create capabilities that neither could achieve alone. The radar had found the target, the light had illuminated it, and the depth charges had destroyed it. But success had required the integration of all these elements under the guidance of trained professionals who understood both the possibilities and limitations of their equipment. Word of the successful night attack spread quickly through Allied maritime patrol squadrons, carried by radio messages that were carefully encrypted to prevent German interception. Within hours, similar techniques were being employed by aircraft operating from bases in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and the Azores, their crews eager to test their own skills against the submarine menace that had terrorized Atlantic shipping for so many months. The German response was swift and systematic. New standing orders required all submarines to dive immediately upon sighting aircraft, regardless of the time of day or weather conditions. Radar warning receivers were improved and their sensitivity increased, while submarine commanders were instructed to avoid surface operations whenever possible. Most significantly, U-boat tactics began to emphasize deeper diving depths and longer submerged patrols, accepting reduced effectiveness in exchange for improved survival rates. But the technological momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. American aircraft factories were producing maritime patrol planes at a rate that German industry could not match, while radar manufacturing had become a specialized industry, employing thousands of technicians and engineers. The electronic warfare that had begun as an experimental program in a few British laboratories had evolved into a massive industrial effort that could detect, track, and destroy submarines with mechanical efficiency. The psychological impact on German submarine crews was perhaps even more significant than the tactical advantages gained by Allied forces. Veterans who had once moved through the Atlantic shipping lanes with confidence now spoke of feeling constantly watched, pursued by invisible enemies that could appear without warning from the empty sky. The ocean that had once offered protection and concealment now seemed filled with electronic eyes that never slept, never tired, and never forgot what they had seen. Oberleutnant Hans-Georg Fischer of U-109 captured this transformation in his war diary. "We are no longer submarine commanders, but fugitives, running from detection systems that track us like bloodhounds. The Americans have turned the ocean into a laboratory, where we are the subjects of their mechanical experiments. They hunt us not with courage or skill, but with mathematics and precision instruments that reduce warfare to a problem in engineering." By September 1943, the statistical evidence of this transformation had become undeniable. German U-boat losses were occurring at a rate of nearly 1 per day, while Allied shipping losses had dropped to their lowest level since the war began. The great submarine offensive that had threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines was collapsing under the weight of technological superiority that made traditional submarine tactics obsolete. The success of radar-guided maritime patrol operations had implications far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. It demonstrated that modern warfare would increasingly favor forces that could integrate new technologies with proven tactics. That victory would belong to those who could adapt most quickly to changing conditions. The comfortable assumptions that had governed military thinking for generations were being swept away by innovations that made older methods of fighting not just obsolete, but suicidal. Lieutenant Commander Addy's attack on U-454 became a case study taught at maritime patrol training centers throughout the Allied world. The precise coordination between radar operator, pilot, and bombardier was analyzed in detail, with particular attention paid to the timing sequences that had made success possible. New techniques were developed to improve accuracy and reduce the time required to complete an attack, while equipment modifications enhanced the reliability of radar detection under adverse weather conditions. The human cost of this technological revolution was measured not just in lives lost, but in the psychological transformation of those who survived. Maritime patrol crews who had once considered themselves glorified lifeguards now found themselves operating some of the war's most sophisticated weapon systems, their decisions guided by scientific instruments and mathematical calculations rather than instinct and experience. They had become the operators of killing machines whose efficiency would have been unimaginable just months earlier. German submarine commanders, for their part, discovered that their years of training and experience counted for little against detection systems that operated according to the laws of physics rather than the customs of naval warfare. Skills that had been developed through decades of peacetime exercises and combat experience were suddenly irrelevant, replaced by new requirements for electronic countermeasures and underwater endurance that had never been part of traditional submarine warfare. The industrial implications of this transformation were equally profound. Allied aircraft production had been reorganized to emphasize maritime patrol capabilities, with entire factories dedicated to producing the specialized radar equipment and weapons systems required for anti-submarine warfare. The British magnetron tubes that made centimetric radar possible were being manufactured by the thousands in American factories, while research laboratories worked around the clock to develop improved detection systems and more effective weapons. The German submarine construction program, meanwhile, was forced to divert increasing resources to defensive measures rather than offensive capabilities. New boats incorporated improved radar warning receivers, better underwater performance, and enhanced structural strength to survive depth charge attacks. But these defensive improvements came at the cost of the range and firepower that had made earlier U-boats so effective against merchant shipping. By October 1943, the transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic was complete. What had begun as a contest between individual commanders armed with traditional weapons had evolved into an industrial competition between opposing technological systems. The side that could produce better detection equipment, more reliable guidance systems, and more effective weapons would dominate the ocean regardless of the courage or skill of individual crews. The statistics from the final months of 1943 told the story with mathematical precision. German U-boat losses exceeded 40 boats per month, while Allied shipping losses dropped to negligible levels. Experienced submarine commanders who had survived years of combat patrols were disappearing at an alarming rate, their expertise lost forever beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic. The great submarine offensive that had brought Britain to the brink of starvation was collapsing under the weight of Allied technological superiority. Admiral Karl Dönitz, facing the destruction of his submarine fleet, was forced to acknowledge what his most experienced commanders had been reporting for months. The Battle of the Atlantic had been lost not through any failure of courage or tactical skill, but through the remorseless application of scientific methods to the ancient art of warfare. His boats were being hunted by machines that never tired, never lost concentration, and never forgot what they had detected. The final irony was that many of the electronic systems destroying German submarines had been developed using principles discovered by German scientists before the war. The magnetron tubes that powered Allied radar sets were based on research conducted at German universities, while the mathematical theories that guided Allied anti-submarine operations had been published in German scientific journals. The war had become a contest to see which side could most effectively apply scientific knowledge to military problems, and the Allies had proven more successful at transforming laboratory discoveries into battlefield advantages. As winter approached in 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had been transformed from a German lake into an Allied highway. Convoys that had once crept across the ocean in fear now sailed with confidence, protected by an invisible shield of electronic surveillance that made submarine attack almost impossible. The merchant sailors who had lived in constant fear of torpedo attack could now focus on the mundane challenges of navigation and weather, secure in the knowledge that prowling U-boats were themselves being hunted by forces they could neither see nor escape. The technological revolution that had saved Allied shipping would continue to evolve throughout the remaining years of the war, producing increasingly sophisticated detection systems and more effective weapons. But the fundamental transformation had been completed in those crucial months of 1943, when radar-guided aircraft had broken the back of the German submarine offensive and demonstrated the decisive role that electronic warfare would play in all future conflicts. Lieutenant Commander Howard Adey completed his patrol and returned to base at RAF Sullom Voe in the Shetland Islands, his crew quiet with the satisfaction of a successful mission. The attack on U-454 had lasted less than 5 minutes from first radar contact to final explosion, but those few minutes represented the culmination of years of scientific research, industrial development, and tactical innovation. They had witnessed the future of warfare, where victory would belong to those who could best combine human judgment with mechanical precision. The story of radar-guided anti-submarine warfare became one of the great technological triumphs of World War II. A demonstration that scientific methods could be successfully applied to military problems with decisive results. It showed that modern warfare would increasingly favor forces that could adapt quickly to new technologies, that could integrate complex systems under combat conditions, and that could maintain the industrial capacity necessary to produce sophisticated equipment in large quantities. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that courage and skill alone were no longer sufficient for military success. The submarine commanders who had terrorized Allied shipping with their daring attacks had been defeated not by braver opponents, but by better equipped ones. The future belonged to those who could harness the power of science and industry to the ancient purposes of war, transforming laboratory discoveries into battlefield advantages with ruthless efficiency. The ocean that had once seemed limitless and unknowable had been tamed by radio waves and mathematical calculations, its vast expanse reduced to patterns of light on cathode ray tubes. The age of electronic warfare had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the eternal struggle between those who would hide and those who would find them. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you.